Amelia let her fingers dance across the ivory keys. Midnight had come and gone, but still, she played. The notes swirled around her, a symphony of her own making. Tonight, something felt different. A coldness crept into the room, a prickling at the back of her neck. A note resonated, deeper than the piano should allow. It vibrated in her teeth. Fear, a stranger to Amelia, tightened its grip. Amelia paused, her fingers hovering above the keys. The coldness intensified. A shiver ran down her spine, raising goosebumps on her arms. She turned, her heart pounding against her ribs. There, in the shadows, something moved. It was a shifting mass, blacker than the night itself. It oozed across the floor, a viscous, living shadow. Terror, raw and consuming, seized Amelia. She tried to scream, but no sound escaped her lips. The black mass pulsed, and from its depths, a melody arose. It was twisted, discordant, the antithesis of music. The melody wrapped around Amelia, suffocating her, pulling her down into its darkness. Her vision blurred, her knees buckled. The last thing she saw before the darkness claimed her was the black goo, flowing towards her like a tide of oblivion. Amelia awoke with a gasp, her body bathed in sweat. The remnants of the nightmare clung to her mind, vivid and unsettling. Sunlight streamed through her window, chasing away the remnants of the nightmare. The warm rays felt like a gentle reassurance, a promise of a new day. She sat up, her heart still racing, and looked around the room. The familiar surroundings brought a sense of comfort, yet the fear lingered. There was no sign of the black goo, no trace of the discordant melody that had haunted her dreams. Everything was in its place, neat and orderly. It had been a dream, she told herself, just a bad dream. But the vividness of it all made it hard to shake off the unease.
Sighs, looking around. It was just a dream, just a bad dream. She repeated the words, hoping they would bring some comfort.
She pushed the memory away, trying to convince herself it was just her imagination. The more she thought about it, the more it seemed to fade. She had been working too hard, practicing late into the night. The stress and exhaustion were taking their toll on her mind. It was no wonder her mind played tricks on her. She would take a break today, clear her head, and forget all about the nightmare. A walk in the park, some fresh air, and a moment of peace would do her good. The orchestra studio buzzed with activity, a hive of creativity and anticipation. Musicians tuned their instruments, their voices a cacophony of sound, blending into a chaotic symphony of preparation. Each note, each string, each breath was a step closer to the performance. Amelia sat at the grand piano, her fingers poised above the keys, ready to bring her creation to life. Her heart raced with a mix of excitement and trepidation. Today was the day they would rehearse her new composition, a piece she had poured her soul into. The room was filled with an air of expectancy. She took a deep breath, trying to ignore the unease that gnawed at her. The memory of the haunting melody from her dream lingered, casting a shadow over her thoughts. As the conductor raised his baton, the discordant melody from her dream echoed in her mind. It was a melody that had haunted her nights, a tune that seemed to come from the depths of her fears. She tried to push it away, but it was too late. The notes from her nightmare began to spill from her fingers, unbidden and unstoppable. Her fingers moved on their own, striking the keys with a force that belied her fear. The music that emerged was dark, twisted, and filled with an eerie intensity. The music that filled the studio was not the symphony she had composed. It was something else entirely, something born of her deepest fears. It was the twisted, horrifying melody from her nightmare, a sound that seemed to warp the very air around her. The music that filled the studio was not the symphony she had composed. It was a manifestation of her darkest fears, a melody that had clawed its way from her subconscious. It was the twisted, horrifying melody from her nightmare, a sound that seemed to warp the very air around her, leaving a chilling silence in its wake. Section 5, The Producer's Demise.
This is not the music we expected.
It was chaotic, unsettling, a violation of their senses. They exchanged uneasy glances. Something was wrong.
We need to stop the rehearsal, demand an explanation.
As they moved, the black goo seeped from beneath the stage. It flowed around their ankles, silent and swift. They cried out in alarm, struggling against the viscous grip that pulled them down into the darkness. Their screams were swallowed by the discordant melody, their pleas for help lost in the cacophony. Section 6. A scene of horror. The police arrived to a scene of unimaginable horror. The air was thick with tension, and the ground was slick with a mixture of blood and an unidentifiable black goo. The officers, seasoned veterans of the force, had never encountered anything quite like this. The orchestra studio was a charnel house, the air thick with the metallic scent of blood. Instruments that once produced beautiful melodies now lay in ruin, their surfaces marred by the same black substance that coated the floor. Instruments lay shattered on the floor, their strings coated in a viscous black substance. The once vibrant room, filled with the sounds of creativity and passion, was now a silent witness to the chaos that had unfolded. Of the producers, there was no sign. The room bore the marks of a violent struggle, but the people who had been there were conspicuously absent, leaving behind only the evidence of their desperate fight. Only Amelia remained, seated at the grand piano, her fingers still dancing across the keys. She seemed oblivious to the destruction around her, lost in the haunting melody she played.
What? What happened here? The officer's voice trembled as he took in the scene, his mind struggling to comprehend the horror before him.
Her eyes were blank, her face devoid of emotion. It was as if she was in a trance, disconnected from the reality of the gruesome scene surrounding her. She played on, oblivious to the carnage around her, lost in the thrall of the dark melody. The music seemed to have a life of its own, weaving through the air like a sinister spell. The police officers exchanged horrified glances. What had happened here? Their minds raced with questions, but answers seemed elusive in the face of such inexplicable horror. Who was this woman, and what had she done? The mystery of Amelia and the dark events that had transpired in the studio would haunt them for a long time to come. Section 7. The Voice Within. Amelia sat alone in her cell, the silence deafening. She stared at her hands, those instruments of creation, now stained with something darker than she could have imagined. She had no memory of what had happened, no explanation for the carnage. Had she done this? Was she capable of such horror?
Had I done this? Was I capable of such horror?
A voice, smooth as silk, whispered in her mind.
Fear not, Amelia, it said. You are mine now. We are one.
Amelia shuddered. Whose voice was it? And what did it mean? She was one with it? The concert hall buzzed with anticipation.
Amelia, the celebrated pianist, was about to perform.
She sat at the grand piano, a solitary figure bathed in the spotlight. She felt no fear, no remorse, only a strange sense of anticipation. The voice within her purred its approval.
As her fingers touched the keys, the discordant melody filled the hall.
The audience stirred, their initial discomfort giving way to fear. The black goo erupted from the stage, a monstrous wave that crashed over the orchestra pit, engulfing the musicians. Screams ripped through the concert hall as the black goo flowed into the audience. Those it touched thrashed and convulsed, their bodies contorting in unnatural ways. They attacked each other with a ferocity born of madness, their screams echoing through the hall.
Amelia played on, her fingers a blur of motion, the dark melody driving the audience into a frenzy. She was no longer a musician, but a conduit, a vessel through which something ancient and evil flowed.
The police stormed the concert hall, their weapons drawn. The carnage was beyond anything they had ever seen. Bodies littered the floor, twisted and broken. The air was thick with the stench of blood and the cloying sweetness of decay. And there, at the center of it all, sat Amelia.
She had stopped playing, but the smile that curved her lips sent shivers down their spines. It was not a smile of joy, but of triumph, of cold, calculating malice.
It is done, the voice whispered in her mind.
Amelia smiled, a slow, predatory stretching of her lips.
Yes, she replied, her voice cold and empty. It is done.
The investigators were baffled. The carnage at the concert hall defied explanation. They had apprehended Amelia, but she remained silent, her eyes cold and distant. She had become a mystery, an enigma that haunted their dreams.
One thing was certain. Amelia was gone. In her place stood something else. Something monstrous. Something that wore her skin like a mask.
"The music has just begun," whispered the entity that had once been Amelia.
And in her eyes they saw a reflection of the abyss, a glimpse into the heart of darkness.